the end of history, and the first man is what we should have said. And
wow.
would that first man have been Trump? I don't know. I don't think so.
No, I think he's a grave digger. He's not a
But he's making lots of money. Digging. If you can't build those buildings upwards, dig those graves downwards. We're going to build the biggest grave you've ever seen. Actually, that sounds really bad. I didn't.
Yeah.
Milan ou Tripoli, Vilnius ou Benghazi, Paris, Moscou, on fait le bunga, bunga, Bangkok ou Bogota, Le Caire ou Jakarta, Gustavia, on fait le bunga, bunga, Stockholm ou Monaco, ou Montevideo, Oslo, Tokyo, on fait le bunga, bunga.
Hello. It's late August. It's BungaCast, the global politics podcast. At the end of history, I'm Alex Hochuli in São Paulo, Brazil. I'm with George Hoare in London. Hello.
Hey.
So this is going to be, this is our regular end of month episode where we, amongst other things, deal with your questions and comments from over the past month. This is being recorded a little bit in advance because for reasons of travel on both our parts, work, holidays, etc. We're taking a little break. There's going to be some, you'll have already seen that there was an unlocked episode earlier on this week from when you're hearing this, and there's going to be something else we're going to re-release next week, and then we're back to our usual programming, which I should actually give a shout out now to. So what we've got coming up in September, we're very happy to be bringing you Orlando Patterson on slavery and race and freedom and self-emancipation. Alex Gurevich has done a fantastic interview with someone who, if you're not familiar, is a leading scholar on the historical sociology of slavery. He is the author of a number of books. You might know Slavery and Social Death, the concept of social death. That's his. A number of novels and a career in politics as well. A fascinating biographical history, which is brought out in the interview, as well as these more kind of theoretical and conceptual matters and historical matters. So that's very exciting. Very excited for that to come out in September. We're continuing the reading club. The third episode in the block on the middle class is continuing by looking at Jordan Therborn, the Swedish sociologist, on the dreams and nightmares of the world's middle classes. We've also got Richard Williams telling us about expressways that have stopped being urban wounds on the landscape and have become actual places. There's a bunch of examples of this we'll talk about in New York, London, Glasgow, São Paulo, Seoul, and many places beyond that. We're also going to be having an episode on state capitalism, which is kind of part of an ongoing discussion that we've been having, particularly this year, on the changing nature of capitalism, the rise of China, and so on. Ila Salami will tell us about that. Ryan Zikraf, who I should mention now, has joined us as a contributing editor to this podcast. I should maybe do this thing. Yep. Whoa. Yeah. So Ryan will be, he's going to be joining us much more regularly, but also he's going to be specifically on early on in the month on details to be announced, but American politics and culture will be coming onto that in more detail in a bit. So all that to look forward to in June and some very exciting stuff in October, but you'll have to wait until a month from now to find out what that is. So more specifically on to today's matters, we thought we would elaborate a little bit here to start before we deal with your questions and comments from the past month on this idea of decline or decay. This was already a question which we dealt with in episode 500, kind of a big anniversary episode, which we did also with Lee Jones and Alex Gurevich. And there we kind of toyed with different ideas of, what exactly is decline? What kind of decline do you talk about? Is decline always about your civilization against someone else's, which is rising? Decline of the West, that's kind of typically how it's understood. Is decay something which is maybe the better term because it refers to institutions rather than a whole order? There's lots of different ways to think about this, and there isn't really any fixed kind of way of talking about this stuff, is there?
Yeah, I think one of the interesting things about decay, decline, all this sort of thing is everyone's talking about it. It seems to be increasingly inescapable. For example, reading the current issue of Tribune, the British socialist magazine, their kind of the theme is after decline. It's about, are there ways we can, or places we can look for hope in an obviously collapsing Britain. My words, not theirs. And yeah, there's some really interesting stuff in there. Friend of the podcast, Dan Evans, has a piece on the decline of the local, or more just going litter picking where he lives in Wales, and just there's syringes and all kinds of just shit on the in the park, and it's like these things which seem to be more and more observable, particularly in perhaps Western Europe. Yeah, what do they actually all mean? And it's got a good quote on the back cover, which Alex, you can tell us where it's from. It's from Marx, though. In history, as in nature, decay is the laboratory of life, which I think is a very neat, very great quote, actually.
So I looked this up because I wasn't familiar with this quote, and I was like, maybe this is like in one of these letters that Marx has, where you're like, I don't know, letter to Kugelman or something, and then looked it up. So apparently it's from the French version of Capital, and it was not reproduced in the German version, and as a consequence, probably not reproduced in the English version, which will have been translated from the German original. In English, as in nature, putrefaction is a laboratory of life. Obviously, putrefaction can be translated as decay, but yeah, apparently this is from the French edition of the first version of Capital. So there you go. But
podcasts are a bit like those kind of letters, right? These are kind of our letters to Kugelman, right? Where we say,
are you listening, Kugelman?
Yeah, I mean, if you are listening, Kugelman, why don't you give us a podcast back? I know we're going to talk about actual letters to the editor, but no, I guess the key thing here is always, or that I think the episode 500 clarified for me a little bit, is okay. You have all these different models. Analytically, how do they differ? That's not unimportant. But what's the political stakes of talking about decline or decay or something else?
Yeah,
and I think this is something which you've. Sorry, that was a bit of an artless segue, but you have something in American affairs, Alex, don't you?
Well, it became artless once you started being meta about it.
Yeah, this is why you're the host, and I'm just some Kugelman character.
Hey, Kugelman. No, anyway, less about Kugelman, but actually one last nerdy thing, which I realize now because you brought to my attention this quote about putrefaction, decay being the laboratory of life, which is that Adorno has a reading of Oswald Spengler's The Decline of the West, in which he kind of tries to reevaluate it and try to find the rational kernel in it. And I actually used a line from that in this thing I have out in American Affairs about techno-feudalism. Actually, long-time listeners of this podcast will already be privy to a lot of the arguments, because there were things that were developed and explored in our reading club on techno-feudalism, which was done, I think, 2 years ago, as well as recent discussions where this has kind of come up. All these ways of talking about crisis, about decay, about decadence, about the confusion, disturbance, dislocations of our times, we're all kind of, in some ways, and also from very different philosophical, political, disciplinary perspectives, all kind of trying to talk about the end of history, talk about the chaos of our times. How do you conceptualize that, right? Anyway, so Adorno, who might now, I think about it, be familiar with this quotation from Marx in the French edition of Capital, he says that in a brutal and oppressed life, decadence becomes the refuge of a potentially better life by renouncing its allegiance to this one and to its culture, its crudeness, and its sublimity, right? So you might find some seeds of the future in embracing decay, in understanding the fact that there's no saving this form of society. That might be hopeful.
Yeah, I am drawn to the idea that all ways to describe our current moment are symptomatic, except for the end of history. And so there's the actual description, and then it's like, oh, it's interesting you choose to talk about decay. This means that you are, I don't know. Well, but actually, a good example, I think, catastrophe. People who talk too much about catastrophe, I think it's a disavowal, and it is, I think, deeply ideological, because it puts forward an objective crisis. But I think our problems are all subjective at the moment. They're all there's not, they're not. It's not out there. It's in here.
That's undialectical. Cool. Undialectical as usual, George.
The call is coming from inside the house. as it always
because
does.
I'm always skeptical of those arguments, because it just means, like, if you just pull yourself up by your bootstraps, be subjective, do
Yeah,
politics, things will
yeah,
be better. And it's like,
yeah,
okay, so
yeah.
easy. Yeah.
It is. I mean, it's not that easy, but it's not that hard. I was going to say no. It's very hard. But anyway, I think also disruption is another good
Yeah.
example of a kind of ideological framing, which I think is quite not completely transparent, but at its Silicon Valley edges, it's like, yeah, any change, any decline of the old institutions is actually liberating, is freeing. And this, of course, we've talked about this a number of times on the podcast, particularly probably with relation to the family and family abolition, as you see this kind of accelerationism as a kind of excuse for kind of decline and collapse and entropy.
Yeah. And I think,
which is implausible, or I don't know. It
but
seems to
you
me
point
like
at something. You point at something interesting, which is right. The Silicon Valley accelerationists, for lack of a better word, and I think Nick Land most expresses this in much crystallized form, but you can trace that back down to maybe slightly less extreme versions of this of Peter Thiel, down to more banal cases of all the way down to kind of, what's the enlightened altruism? Yeah, enlightened altruism and various kind of utilitarian ideas. But they all kind of, in a way, try to embrace rationalization and disruption at the same time as a positive. And a lot of other people from post-liberal, conservative, left-wing perspectives, various, from across the spectrum, but all those who would be not identified with kind of centrist neoliberalism, etc., are themselves trying to go, well, actually, no, maybe this disruption isn't good. Although, again, but there's different emphases, right? There's different emphases.
yeah,
So
and I guess that kind of normative evaluation, as much as was about to look down my nose at kind of either the conservative, everything's worse than it used to be, that kind of complaint, or the kind of everything's better than it used to be, look how free we are, as both as being kind of one-sided. I guess my instinct is that decay is bad. I don't like it when things when things don't work. It might be just my kind of
you're a spring
narrow.
guy, not an autumn guy.
No, I'm an autumn guy, actually. Interestingly,
That's a time of
aesthetically.
decay. Yeah.
Yeah, true. Yeah, but I mean, decay on trees and leaves is better than decay in institutions and society, in my opinion, at least.
True.
But I just might be this kind of narrow-minded Anglo who's like wants things to work, and I just want the trains to run on time and all that kind of stuff. But yeah,
Back to more kind of more abstract theorizations of this, perhaps. But yeah, I think there. So as we said, we're all trying to grapple with the breakdown of something, right? And yeah, I suggest think about it like in four Ds, right? Disruption, disturbance, decline, and decay. It's worth maybe just going through these briefly, because I think disruption is the Silicon Valley ideology, right? Very clearly, we've discussed this in the terms of the Californian ideology, and particularly as you take that forward to contemporary age, you find that a lot of the ideals of that Silicon Valley actually turn into almost their opposite, right? And as it happens, Cédric Durand's reading of techno-feudalism, his techno-feudal theory, which, as I've said before, it's by far the best of the lot of them. I still think it has very significant problems, but it's definitely if you want to read one book on techno-feudalism, definitely do that one. But he points out, all this idea of like a new economic dynamism based on startups. Well, that's just actually resulted in a bunch of monopolies, right? Workplace autonomy and creativity, be able to express yourself at work, et cetera, et cetera. Actually, that's just led to an intensification of control at work. Like the culture of like openness and mobility, like the Google campus, this little kind of utopia, dystopian, quite dystopian utopia that they've built, actually leads into spatial polarization, right? Of like cities, rich urban cores, and a hinterland where actual real production happens. Goods are assembled, produced, sorted, distributed. Animals are reared and killed, and all the rest of it. They rely on themselves, but that polarization is a major consequence of that culture of openness. The idea that there might be the Silicon Valley world, once Silicon Valley takes over, everyone will become, rich as long as you can participate and work hard. And in fact, it's produced innovation without growth, right? Lots of new stuff, but it doesn't seem to really turn the wheels of production and wealth, really, of social wealth. And then finally, like that, this means the state would be obsolete. And actually, no, it's only proved the resilience of the role of the state which created the internet and various other things as well. Mariana Mazzucato is obviously the reference here as regards to the entrepreneurial state. But anyway, so these are all kind of really deeply contradictory elements of the Silicon Valley ideology as it's been put into practice. And it all looks a lot darker than the sunny version of it, which existed in the 80s and 90s.
Yeah, no, that kind of techno-utopianism, we should direct listeners to our California Calibunga series, which has a lot of stuff about that and gets that the kind of yeah, I mean, sunny literally in California, like the sun is out, you've got great wine, you've got weed, you can go to the beach and have a good time, and the yuppies and the hippies are kind of don't like each other, but they're moving things forward, and now it is much more we've said this many times, but a definite feeling of dread pervades maybe doom, but at least dread.
But yeah, I mean, and the Silicon Valley types are still, as particularly the oligarch intellectuals, as Yevgeny Morozov calls them, like the kind of your Peter Thiel being the exemplary figure in this. Though Musk as well. Musk has his own ideas. I mean, like to mock him as a kind of an idiot, and he may be, but certainly has his own ideas. To the extent that there's I think Quinn Slobodian's next book is on Musk ideology, Musk thought. So there's enough there to write a book at least about. Be actually intriguing to read that once it comes out. But all these people are trying to basically take disruption and all these kind of things which we identify as negative, as most people nowadays are kind of, most citizens across the West are kind of going, well, these are all the bad things that are happening now, and they kind of go, yeah, but it's good, and actually what we need to do is take it further. And again, Nick Land does that in the most extreme fashion, but it also is in a way useful for setting it out clearly.
I think you said earlier, Nick Land, the most crystallized, and that just made me think of like crystals of drugs. And also, I always get this kind of drugs, like very speedy ketamine vibe from Nick Land's work. But in some ways, it's the most. I'm trying to think of a synonym for crystallized, but it's the most invigorating.
Distilled, which is another drug, I guess. Yeah, the best one, the best drug. Anyway. Disturbance would be the second D, right? And I think that just stands in general for kind of turbulence, the breakdown of the neoliberal order. And here I think it becomes often a little bit more geopolitical, right? The rise of non-Western powers, or the rise of authoritarian populists, or the rise, in various different formulations. And a lot of that is advanced by effectively the neoliberal center, right? This is the concerns over disturbance are effectively knobs concerns. It's neoliberal order breakdown syndrome. It's the world is falling beyond our grasp. There are new powers challenging us. The unquestioned hegemony of American empire is falling apart, and with it, a lot of the kind of ideological features of it. And then it's like, well, now everything feels completely at sea. And you find this particularly in amongst but U.S. Democrats, and then in Germany, where it's like a completely vassalized state to the U.S., and then the rug gets pulled out from under it, and they're like, shit, we now have to make decisions for ourselves now. What the fuck do we do? And I think you could even, and here I'm more sympathetic to the author I'm about to mention, but Adam Tooze's theorization, I guess, of polycrisis, is a much more sophisticated version of this. And I'm not saying it's just knobs, but it seems to me also, as we've discussed on this podcast before, exemplary of an intellectual failure of being able to really say what it is that's going on here, right? It's not a crisis of capitalism, or a crisis of modernity, or a crisis of industrial society, as you might have said in the past, or even, fetishistically, it's all the cause of the Jews, or whatever other scapegoat you might wish to choose. It's like, it's polycrisis. It's everything everywhere all at once, which I don't think helps us very much. And it's great. It sounds good when it comes out of the mouth of Twos, who is abreast of so many different things going on, an extremely wide reader, and is able to kind of synthesize this in a slightly, digestible format. But in anyone else's hands, it just becomes like, the map matches the terrain. It's a one-to-one representation of reality, which doesn't help us at all, because theory is meant to reduce the world in some sense.
The map
right?
is too big. I've always, people always go on about this map and territory, this Borges. The map would be too big. I mean, this is the problem. If the map includes absolutely everything, just seems madness to me.
Exactly. So anyway, I think polycrisis ultimately speaks to speaks to managers, right? Speaks to the managerial class, because polycrisis says all these things are happening all at once, and therefore, there's no future point, a utopian point from which to criticize contemporary society. This is all the problem of capitalism, and if we have socialist revolution, things will be improved, right? It doesn't have that. It's a polycrisis, but stuck in an eternal present. So what's the best you can do? Try to effectively manage these compounding crises. And then I think that just plays into a kind of managerial ideology. So I think that's who polycrisis is for. I can't get beyond that. It's not a revolutionary doctrine. It's not even like really a genuinely reformist one, because it doesn't even necessarily propose, let's have
it's
a democratic revolution, right? To gain control, take back control or whatever. No, it doesn't even say that, because ecological crises are beyond, everything's beyond. And so I don't know. You need to,
Yeah, no, I do. I think there is a note of that, isn't there? It's about the difficulty of control and management, and it's a kind of, I mean, won't somebody think of the managers and all the things which they have to manage? Must be difficult out there to, crisis. That's hard to manage. Polycrisis. Oh, give us a break, guys. Yeah, I don't find myself reaching for disruption or disturbance very often, though, in the way that I would talk about things. So I'm kind of that's two Ds down. What are the other two Ds?
yeah, more D's. It's like that gif of the girl being hit with all the frankfurters all at once. Yeah, maybe we'll use that as a cover image, or maybe not.
Maybe not.
That's
Maybe not.
Not a probe. So anyway, decline and decay. Now here I find them more difficult to disentangle. I think there's a tendency to see decline as something going down and something else rising, but decay also presupposes that, right? Decay is followed by birth, is followed by decay, the kind of organic cycle of things, which is a feature of thought back to the classics. So it's kind of, it almost sounds a bit, it's banal effectively. So it's quite hard to disentangle. I know that Lee Jones proposed, no, we should think about decay, because he's thinking about decay, particularly in terms of institutions, right? So it's a decay of economic growth, of economic vitality. It's the decay of representative political institutions of democracy. And it's the decay in a more geopolitical or international relations sense of the institutions that arose after the end of the Second World War, and particularly were dominant at the end of the Cold War. And it's the breakdown of those, or the challenge of those, internal and external, that characterize our times. And I think that's useful because it analyzes those things in a concrete sense in the West. But I think we can probably go a little bit further in trying to kind of schematize the typologies of decline or decay, and here without any preference to one term or the other, because I think they're almost synonymous, and I'm not sure there's not much useful in kind of quibbling about which one you use. But I think that one can, and this is something that Alex Gurevich said in episode 500, but to elaborate a little bit more on it, I think you can talk about normative and descriptive decay. Does that make sense to you, George?
Yeah, very much so. Although it's difficult entirely to separate the normative and the descriptive in this case, as in many such cases. But I think there is a particularly conservative lament when it comes to decline, that you have a once great society, you have a normative image or normative past, or real or constructed, or a construction of what is partly real, and then it's a falling away from that greatness, usually due to some moral problem. And a descriptive account is obviously starts from a completely different place, and you can think of someone like Wolfgang Streeck. You would see, or perhaps the account given by Peter Mayer and used by many from his work. These are two examples of decay, of how institutions undermine themselves or come to through their internal dynamics. I think generally some external factors, but generally it's an internal process. They come to become contradictory and stop working in one way or another.
And it can be, it's kind of new. It's descriptive because it's neutral. It could be empirical, but it can also be analytical, or it can be a structural account. But I think that is not so important when we think about descriptive versus normative. It's to say, look, this order as a whole, or this institution, or these sets of institutions are falling apart in some way, and something else might be rising, and you're just looking at them neutrally. And you might, to an extent, you can say, even Marx's account of capitalism's internal contradictions say, well, there's a sense of it becoming, overripe and has to be overthrown through revolution. There's a descriptive a sense to that, whereas the normative one is really like a sense of loss, and often is about kind of questions of morality or virtue, right? That our Western societies have become decadent, which is, decayed effectively, but they've become morally decadent. But I think there's also a normative sense in which things were better. We just say some things were better before. And you might say, if you look back at our position now versus the 1990s or versus the 1970s, you might say, well, in certain respects, we're worse off now today, right? And so there's a normative, if you're being materialist about it, I don't think, and particularly materialism, not just which is about things, but in a much more live sense of materialism, the normative and the descriptive aren't easily disentangled, or one shouldn't seek to disentangle them, because you can make a claim about, in relation to, for example, freedom. Were we more free before? Did we have the more conditions of collective autonomy, of democracy, which made us more free before than we are now? Yes, clearly. So I think there's a normative decline as much as there is as a descriptive one.
Yeah. So I guess kind of on the other side of all of this, so because it seems like if everyone is talking about disruption, disturbance, decay or decline, what is the kind of other side of it? Who are the people who are giving a kind of alternative account? And there's a good piece in the most recent New Left Review on basically comparing Trump's, what the Chinese call winism, his kind of, all about wins, 50 wins in 50 days, and kind of, his ebullience, put it that way, with Fukuyama's kind of triumphalism at the end of although as we talked about, and hopefully by this point readers of the book or listeners to the podcast know that Fukuyama wasn't like, it's liberal democracy is the only game in town, it's all done. He was like, this is going to be not great, flabby, prosperous, self-satisfied, inward-looking, weak-willed states whose grandest project was nothing more heroic than the creation of the common market. So he wasn't like, there was a kind of win, but you haven't played very well, and you're just like, we don't have any more competition now, so we're ultimately going to get worse anyway. So I think maybe this is part of Trump's appeal to a great extent, and this isn't actually what the piece in the New Left Review argues, but the kind of the going against the contemporary pessimism and the decline, and just the general kind of bad vibes. And here you have somebody who's winning.
It's
you could be a winner too.
It's interesting because in part it's, I guess, countercultural, but in another sense it's entirely with the culture. So it's counterculture in the sense that you describe, that it's like against the pessimism, like, we're going to be winning. But on the other hand, it seems just a taking to a political level of existing entrepreneurial ideology, the ideology of success, that if you're rich, you've made it and you deserve it, and you should just keep on winning. So there's a kind of, I think it kind of plays with both elements there. It tries to present something optimistic, even if it means going back to the past, right? Make America great again. Let's go back to the 1950s. But also an element of like, let's get those quick wins in there. If you hustle, you're gonna get your score, and so it's kind of, in that regard, not so countercultural. Hello friends, you've reached the end of a sample from an episode only available to subscribers. We put out 2 episodes a month for free. For access to the rest in its entirety, please join us at patreon.com/bungacast. For $7 a month, subscribers receive original, exclusive episodes with the entirety of the BungaCast cast. That's George Hoare, myself Alex Hochuli, and our contributing editors, Philip Cunliffe, Amber Lee Frost, Catherine Liu, Lee Jones, Alex Gurevich, and Lee Phillips. We've got extended interviews with guests, episodes on current affairs, and original episodes on theory, history, and culture, so as to understand the crises of our times. We also have the BungaCast Reading Club, where Phil, George, and myself present the key books and essays necessary for understanding the world today, how we got here, and where we might be going. Subscribers also get a digital subscription to Damage magazine, with whom we're partnered, and you can find all this info at patreon.com/bungacast. We do hope you'll join us. These are turbulent times, and ideologically confused ones as well. What we try to do is find political clarity, to move beyond the decadent age of Bunga Bunga.
De A ou pas se taire.